Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's MLA Productivity and Profitability webinar. Tonight, we're joined by Colin Ramsay, who's going to be taking us through the research that has gone into the quest for a more productive meat goat, which is very exciting given the current markets that we're seeing in goats. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll just get stuck into some housekeeping to start with. So this is the control panel that will be in the top right corner of your screen as we speak. The red arrow, the button on the left of the control panel, collapses and reinstates this panel, so you possibly may be able to have a better look at your screen as we go through the presentation. You should be able to hear us, but we cannot hear you. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please type them in the box provided. Please keep these questions specific to the presentation as much as you can. We don't want to be getting too off track tonight because it's such a great topic. We want to be keeping the questions as specific as possible and as relevant as possible to the webinar presentation. So tonight we're joined by Colin Ramsay. So Colin came to goats after a long career in science and finance. He first realised the importance of goats as a boy in Africa, where the local people treasured them as a source of food and wealth. Later working with the nomadics in the Arabian desert, he found that they are viewed the same way there. In the early 1990s, Colin got interested in the Australian feral goat business and how that might be affected by new genetics that were imported from South Africa. Colin bought the family's first goats in the mid-1990s and has been breeding them ever since. He sees great future for the Australian goat industry and works to develop productive Australian adapted goats and extend profitable goat farming practices. Colin now farms with his family near West Wyalong in central New South Wales. So good evening to everyone from West Wyalong and Gondiala area this evening. So thanks, Colin. I'll hand over to you to get the presentation over the out of the way. So here we go. Excellent.
Am I on, Hilary?
Yes, you're good to go. Fire away. Looking forward to it.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. This voice is Colin Ramsey. I'm sitting in Wagga Wagga in southern New South Wales. And I know there are people listening from lots of different places, so time zones are funny, and it's a bit weird sitting here not knowing who you're talking to, but let's give it a go. So this talks about getting goats more productive. I think that's pretty much a motherhood statement that nobody's going to object to. More productive means more meat per unit and more profit and everything else. So I don't believe that's contentious. It's been a quest. It's been going a very long time to try and improve this, and we're only just starting to make progress. But there is progress being made now, genetically and in lots of other ways. And there's a great renewed interest in people developing the productivity of meat goats. So this is a good moment to be sharing the mistakes we made, and hopefully we can stop other people falling in the same holes. Just before we leave this title block, I just want to acknowledge the amazing support that's come from the MLA and Sheep Genetics and Julie Petty and all the previous Julie Pettys. They've hung in with this production meat goat job for many, many years. I've been 25 years in it, and they were there long before that. And there must have been many times when they felt like giving up, but they've kept with it, and And here we are making progress at last. So this is what I'm going to be talking about. This is the map of the talk. The central circle is just very standard production system. You have a herd, you start with mating, you do kidding. 3 or 4 months later, you're weaning, and then another few months later, you're growing and finishing and selling out. Right? So that's completely standard. The red words are the genetic influences that come in at each of those points. So, for example, fertility is the crucial genetic influence or lever in the mating stage. That's fairly obvious. Survival is the key thing at kidding. At weaning, it's how many kids you've got and how worm resistant the kids are. And for growing out and finishing and selling, it's about body weights. Worms are still important, and the overall muscularity of the animal. Those are the subjects what we're talking about. Of course, your herd also lives in a world where there are environmental effects and there are management effects. We're not going to talk about those tonight. This is purely about genetics. Now, you may have noticed up to now there hasn't been a picture of a goat, and that's deliberate. One big lesson we've learned, and we need to pay attention to, is that you cannot see the genetics of production. So what the goat looks like on the outside has very, very little to do with its production capability. And that's a really hard thing to get used to. But so what we're going to look at is mostly data and pictures and charts. I've put a couple of snaps in just for fun, because some people have to have snaps, but basically they have nothing to do with the talk. Here's a little bit of my own housekeeping. Again, to acknowledge the MLA and sheep genetic support that's come through sustained long-term support for KidPlan, even through the time when there was only one participant for years. Isabel Palmer in Western Australia was the only taker of KidPlan for many years, and they kept it going. They supported many projects, and with us, a multi-breeder sire trial in 2013, and then a fast-track project on expanding the best genetics in 2017. They've currently got a critically important project going about kid losses, which is the flip side of survival. That's run by Gordon Rifshagi and Trudy Atkinson, the DPI, and some people from CSU. And there's lots of other projects. So they've done a marvelous job. Now, just a couple of limitations on the work we've done before I get into it. This is on-farm investigation. It's not science. The statistics is often thin. Some of the conclusions may be wrong and hopefully would be proved wrong later. But insofar as we've done it, it's useful and it may indicate some things. As I said before, we're going to be talking about breeding and genetics. I'm going to completely ignore the visual aspects of everything and the husbandry. We know they're both terribly important. And I'm going to be talking to both seed stock people and commercial producers. Now, they both have the same objective in requiring a productive goat. Seed stock people, generally speaking, will be able to perform more intensive breeding programs, and the commercial people will be less able to do so. So some of the things I'll suggest are appropriate to seed stock breeders and some to commercial people. So this is a little bit of history. All this work's been done on the Dudorman herd. The beginning of it goes back a long way, but basically it started in 1999 when we bought 3 B doubles of feral goats from Cobar and Ivanhoe and White Cliffs and a semi from Goulburn, I think it was. And we started crossing up. It was a very simple strategy. The logic is just as good today as it was then. If you start with a lot of females and the best bucks you can get, the best carcass type bucks you can get, you should be able to produce a lot of good prime kids for sale. Now, that situation hasn't changed, and I'm aware of lots and lots of people intending to set off on the same path right now. Now, just a word on appearance. So we started in 1999. That top picture is where we got to by 2006. So that's something like 7 years later. And the bottom picture, sorry, that 2006 was the drought in 2006. The bottom picture is the drought in 2018. So what's that, 12 years later. Really, the appearance of the animals hasn't changed dramatically in that time. It did change, of course, from the first generation crosses, but by 2006, the appearance was pretty much set. And that's to emphasize that of all the criteria we use, the appearance of the animal and the breed always jumps to the front of our attention, but it's actually relatively unimportant compared to the things you can measure and the other parameters we'll talk about here. So it's very easy to get tied up in there. We could have actually chosen to take the appearance of these animals to almost any appearance we wanted. In a very short time, we could have made them red or brown or spotted or black. It's a very easy adjustment to make. We just happened to choose the Boer phenotype to go with. But the key point is that the genetics is invisible. And in here, inside these Boer-looking packages, there are actually composites with a whole lot of non-Boer genes involved. The first problem, of course, always is finding the problem. And it took us a long time to find the problem. This is just a fun picture. So here we go. Now, realizing the problem. After several years of diligently crossing up and selecting animals visually, we began to realize that we had production problems. And we couldn't work out what it was. Our weights were unsatisfactory. They'd been good to start with when the hybrid vigor was very strong, and then it tailed off. The weights dropped. We had no muscling on the animals. We had lots and lots of dead kids, and we just couldn't work out what was going on and why. So, and it went along with husbandry problems, of course, but it became fairly apparent that there were genetic problems. Now, those graphs go from 2004 to 2010. Now, don't worry about what they are so much at the moment. The one at the top left is actually weaning weight. And one of the magic things about kid plan is that once you get your animals in kid plan, you can actually look backwards at what the characteristics of the progeny previously were. So at this time, between 2004 and 2008 or 9, we didn't have any data. We didn't know what the problem was. But now we have the data for that period working backwards. And it's as plain as the nose on your face. The genetics we were using were just horribly deficient in weights, in weaning weights, and in the number of kids, and in the muscularity. It was terrible. And worse than terrible, it was not getting any better. That blue line in each case is the average for the entire kid plan population. The red line is where we were. And deficient is the only word you can use for that. We couldn't work out why this was happening. And eventually it became obvious that we had to start measuring stuff. And we started making observations and feeling our way. we got into KidPlan, and we started selecting on data along with the selections we've been doing previously on structural and visual things. Now, I just want to show you first that you can turn those things around. So in each of those pictures, that is 15 or 16 years of data. Right? The light blue ones are the ones I just showed you before, which were before we started using data in KidPlan. So they're the same low weaning weights for the first 5 years. We started introducing KidPlan selection, numerical selection in 9 or 10, and that has progressively come through into heavier and heavier weaning weights and post-weaning weights. The number of kids that we're getting born and surviving is just steadily increasing. The eye muscle depth similarly is increasing. So again, I don't want you to bother about the detail of this. We'll come back to the important bits, but the message here is that once you introduce numerical selection along with your other selection criteria, tremendous turnaround can be achieved over time. It's not instantaneous. You mustn't get depressed in your first year, but over time you can make enormous changes to your herd. And that's been proved in many other species, of course. Now, you would quite fairly ask, okay, you're getting improvements, but are these improvements of any significance commercially? So this is a bit of a cartoon to try and answer that question for you. We'll start with the blue dots. In our KidPlan database over the years, we've got about 8,500 animals with data. They're not all bred by us, most of them are, and they're all part of our herd in one way or another. Each of those blue dots is one of those animals, and the chart shows on the vertical axis there's the yearling weight. It's an EBV. It's not the actual live weight. It's what KidPlan shows as a departure from a benchmark. And along the horizontal axis, there's an index that KidPlan uses to say the higher number you've got on this index, the better your terminal genetics are. Okay. So that's what the graph shows. On the bottom right in that oval, that is where the sires used to be that we were using between 2006, 2008 in that broad area. And that red line and the -1 says, as an average, those animals had the genetic potential to contribute negative gains compared to the benchmark. Up on the top right, that oval is the sires that we are now using, and they are going +7 on average, +7 kilos above the benchmark. Now, let me just show you what the impact that has financially. If you look at the writing there on the left, the difference between, let's just imagine those two teams of sires competing. One lot has -1, one lot has +7. The difference in the kilos for the sires themselves is 8 kilos difference at yearling age. Half of that gain will go into the progeny, assuming that all the dams are exactly the same. If you then dress that 50%, if you're lucky, you've got 2 kilos and at $8 or $10 a head in the carcass, a kilo in the carcass, you've got $16 to $20 a carcass difference in price. Now that's on the average for the herd. That's not the good ones, not the bad ones. That's the average across the entire herd. Now those numbers are very rubbery. I've only put them there to show you that the benefits you can achieve can be really impressive in terms of money as well as weights and all that. Let's go to the next one. So much for all the good bits. There's one particular area where we've so far had a really, really hard time improving. And that's the survival of kids. So that graph, again, don't worry about the detail. That graph in the blue bars along the bottom shows the surviving percentage of kids from 2009 to 2019. That's so 10 years of data there. The colored, so that is what that means is for every kid that was born, the blue percentage actually survived the market. The green ones died, were found dead, either stillborn or starved to death or just faded away within a short time of birth. And the pink ones disappeared for some mishap, foxes or fell in the river or something like that. So that is a horrible result. Over 10 years, we've consistently had losses of between 30 to 60% of births from any particular drop. 2016, you'll say that's worse than 60%, but it was. We actually got flooded, and from 500 fetuses, we marked 38 kids. So that was a bad one. We've left that out of the stat. But there's no question, survival is the overriding issue. It's very difficult to work out what it is. The MLA's Kid Loss Project is hopefully going to fix some of that up for us. Meantime, it's an unsolved major issue, and we've got a few indicators, but it's far from fixed. I suspect it's a big problem in many, many operations, but I'll tell you what you need to do to find out if you have the problem. So this is just a fun picture to remind those of you who were not here in 2006 that this is what 2006 was like. Sorry, it wasn't fun at all. So the next question is, of all these genetic traits that can influence your productivity, what are the important ones? What have the biggest effect, positive or negative? Michael Aldridge, with MLA's support, has worked all this out and prioritized them in order. And the parameters that he identified as being biggest are top of the pops, kid survival is by far the biggest thing that will damage or assist your productivity. Fertility is next. Body weight is next. The number of kids you wean comes after that. And after that, it's really pretty minor, except that we would add worm resistance to that list. That Michael didn't put that in, but we would include that as a big factor, only obviously in some locations. So the key to it is, if you can fix your kid survival, fertility, and your body rate, you're going to be doing pretty well on productivity. Let's look at those in order. Here's fertility. Now, in our experience, over all the years we've been collecting this data, fertility is very seldom a problem. I have to touch wood when I say that, but when we scan our does routinely average twins, and sometimes it's 220, sometimes 180%. That's the red bars in the chart. Okay? Now, that is the twinning rate. Does not take into account how many dries there were, and that, of course, knocks the percentages back a bit. In our experience, if you mate with multiple bucks, called a syndicate mating, you should easily get over 90% pregnant, or 95 even. If you go with single sires like we do, and seed stock producers frequently do, we get lower percentages than that. And even then, that brings the fertility rate combined down to those blue bars, which is about 180%, sometimes a bit better, sometimes a bit worse. But you have every reasonable expectation to be targeting 180%, 160%, that sort of level of fetuses in your herd. Those are mostly April joinings for September kiddings, and that's the optimum period down our way. You can have a go in mating at Christmas and kidding in autumn. The results are much less consistent, and sometimes you can get bad ones. Very occasionally, we get a dud sire, but it's really negligible, and the fertility overall, the fertility is really excellent. Unlikely to be a worry. If you do have a worry, you have to think seriously about the sires you're using, the bucks. Now here, I said I'd give some indications of what you can do without getting too sophisticated. The seed stock producers would do some quite sophisticated work on fertility, sorry. But if your commercial operation does not permit that, this is one thing you can do very easily, and that is scrotal circumferences, measuring the circumference of the nuts on your bucks. Actually correlates fairly closely with the fertility of the combined male and female. So that's not too hard to do. You can always ask your seed stock producer whether he does it with the size he sells you. But if you find you've got a fertility problem, you don't have sophisticated data, measuring a few circumferences is unpleasant, but an easy practical solution that can tell you an awful lot. Then we come to worm resistance. Let's look at that quickly. Of course, it's only relevant in some places. Many producers don't have an issue, or believe they don't have an issue. Now, this green chart here is the individual worm burdens in different animals running together in the same group. So I can't remember which group this is, but it's 100 animals where we took individual worm counts. And in that case, the one with the highest worm burden was carrying 1,500 eggs a gram, which is pretty horrible. And at the other end of the scale, there were animals with carrying literally no eggs, or at least less than 100. So there's a lot of statistical to and fro about all that, but it's plain as the nose on your face that you don't want those big ones running around the place. That's a very moderate spread. Sometimes we get mobs that go from 0 to 5,000 eggs per gram. And you need to identify those ones and get them out of there just as fast as you can. Enormous improvements are possible, and the damage that a low resistance sire can cause on your productivity and your herd and your patience with drenching is really horrible. So over time, you can build up the resistance, like that red line shows. That's in our lot. And there is another marvelous thing about worm resistance, is that it doesn't correlate with anything. So sometimes these good traits that you find actually act against other traits. But in this case, you can build worm resistance along with, for example, higher body weights. They don't appear to conflict with each other at all. This is body weight. It's simply that red. The yellow line is what's been achieved in our herd over time by selecting with one eye to the body weight. The herd average at 9 to 12 months has increased by 4 kilograms. That's live weight. 4 kilograms over those years. That's a fairly significant improvement in the average. So it's achievable. Now you can combine that. Optimum, of course, for carcass is to combine the body weight and the eye muscle depth. The eye muscle depth, if you're not familiar, is an indicator of the overall muscularity of the animal. And so combining muscularity and weight is going to take you pretty close to a good carcass. So there are the blue dots again. The left-hand axis is the millimeters of eye muscle depth. So you get deeper eye muscles the higher up you are. And the horizontal axis at the bottom is the EBV for yearling weight in kilograms. So the ones over there on the right, they have EBVs 10 kilos higher than the benchmark and 15 kilos higher than the ones on the left. So you can imagine, we won't do the arithmetic, but the green oval shows what the sires were like that we were using in 2006 and 2008. And the red oval shows what the sires are like that we're using now. And we don't need to do the arithmetic to show you what impact that has on your returns per carcass that you're getting. So here's another picture which is less fun. These are the floods. These ladies deposited their kids on dry ground, went away for a browse. When they came back, it was flooded, and they marched off into the floods looking to see if they could find them. So let's leave that one pretty quickly. But it does remind us about kids' survival. Now that's an environmental loss of kids, of course. We're not talking about that. There are many, many factors that interact on survival, and that tree on the right shows some of them. Many more will be found by Gordon Rifshalgi and his guys. But genetically, at least, it's becoming clear that low birth weight is a very major factor. We'll talk about that in a minute. It's becoming clear as well that low vigor in the kids is a death knell for perinatal survival. Then there are other more technical things like the ability of the animal to generate heat and stay warm when it's born into cold weather, and then difficult births, and so on and so forth. That's all ignoring nutrition and the weather effects and predation and mothering, which are all basically environmental impacts. So there are many, many factors interacting on all this. Our experience has been that most of the deaths come immediately after birth. A lot are stillborn, literally born without any life whatever, fully developed, not aborted, full-term kids that never get fired up. The next lot of deaths is the slow kids, which don't have enough energy and vigor to get their first drink. And then they're the ones which are not so slow, but they're still a bit off. They struggle around for a while and then they fall over, or a fox gets them, something goes wrong. One of the big problems with all of this is that despite sheep genetics' marvelous work, we don't yet have a survival EBV. And that is a critical gap in the whole of this argument. We do have birth weights. People who have the time and the ability can measure birth weights. They can be critically important. And we have birth weight EBVs. And the same applies for kid vigor. So just going to those one at a time. Here's birth weight, the first thing on birth. Now we get an awful lot of stories about how the triplets die and twins survive, etc., etc. Our experience really doesn't say that. Those different coloured bars are the weights of, from memory, 850 kids that we've weighed at birth. The different colours are different litter sizes. And you can see from there that in our herd, in our conditions, the optimum birth weight is between 3 and 5 kilos. That's where they like to come. That's where they survive best. I'll show you that in a second. There is some difference between the survival of singles, triplets, and twins, but it's not all that enormous. Deaths, the deaths I've been telling you about occur throughout that weight range. And that's a real puzzle, and I'll come back to that. It's a very important question. But the old adage that if they're too small, they die, doesn't actually apply. They die throughout the whole weight range, including optimum weights. The other thing to remember about this, of course, is that the weights which are right on our place are not necessarily going to be the same weights on your place. On your place, there will be a range which is good, and a range which is too small, and a range which is too high. This takes a little bit of patience, if you can bear with me. So we're still on birth weight. Look at this bottom left-hand chart. Okay? Those blue dots are the percentage of kids born at that weight range, at that weight, which died. Okay? So along the bottom is the actual birth weight in kilos. Lightest one, 1 kilo. Heaviest one, some idiot produced 7.5 kilos. And the left-hand axis shows what percentage of them died. So the percentage of deaths, starting at the top left, basically every kid born between 1 and 2 kilos died. The percentage of deaths decreases, in other words, survival increases, but it's still very substantial as you go up, down here up towards 3 kilos. Between 3 kilos and 5.5 or thereabouts, the survival is really quite good. This is less than 35 or 40% losses. Once you go over the critical weight, the losses go back to high level of losses again. Now, this is a very well-known curve in the sheep business. There's an optimum middle range, and the extremes tend to have very high survival. So focusing on your birth weights can make a very big difference to your survival. and therefore your productivity. This chart on the right tells exactly the same story, but it's done with EBVs rather than individual birth weights. So we don't need to waste time on it. What it means is that if you have a birth survival problem, you can ask your seed stock producer for animals that will produce kids in this optimum range. So if your kids look as though they're weighing very light, you'd only have to weigh 20 or 30 carcasses that you found lying around to know that. You can then go looking for a sire with high birth weight EBV to lift that average birth weight into the high survival zone. And it can make very big differences to your survival rates. Now, there's a good thing about birth weight as well for people who don't have the time or the inclination to measure actual birth weights. It correlates, birth weight correlates very closely with or fairly closely with weaning weight. Many people would do weaning weights routinely. So if the animals you feel like using are turning up with very low weaning weights, that should serve as a warning that the birth weights will be low and the survival will be affected as well. This is the effect that kid vigor has. It's a funny word, kid vigor. When the kid's born, some of them kick you away and get running, and in 20 minutes they're drinking. Others lie there like blobs, won't do anything. We just score those. It's very rough. We just score them 1 to 5. 5's dead already. 4 looks pretty dodgy. 1 is vigorous. 2 is pretty vigorous. And 3 is, we can't make up our minds, it's somewhere in between. And then when you put that with the survival, the results are quite striking. Very high percentage of the Vigor 1 kids actually survive to market. None of the Vigor 4 kids, even though they're up and going and drinking, they don't survive. At the end of the day, somebody gets them or they die, or they go missing. So weak kids are a real liability. Now, why some of them are born slow like that, we don't know. I think that's a question for Gordon Rashelli and the others, and hopefully we're going to get answers. I know he's got lots of theories already, and the data is being collected. The other question this leads you to is you can save a lot of these weak kids by managing the kidding very intensively. And that's simply a question of whether it's worth doing. We know that a lot of people with relatively small herds do manage very intensively and routinely get 200% kid survival. That doesn't mean it's financially worth doing. It doesn't mean it'll work in a commercial environment. But it is possible to do it, and there is a question, depending on what your business is, there's a question about whether and what level of assistance you should give. But the best solution is to find out how to get vigorous kids, and we're all working on that. Now, this is an effect which a lot of people tell me is nonsense. I can't swear that this is statistically valid or anything, but this is what we observe. Okay? Now, the one on the right is the survival percentage of the kids sired by whatever it is, 25 or 30 sires that we've used over the years. Now, there are hundreds upon hundreds of kids included in that. Every sire in that chart from memory has more than 50 kids. So you'd think that measure is reasonable. And just take a look at the survival numbers. There is one sire used there where nearly 80% of the kids survive. You've got to put that in the context of our average losses of 50%. There are other sires on that chart where the losses are, I can't see it on my screen, it's over on the right, where they don't even make 30 or 40% profit. So there does appear to be a very big sire influence on survival. It's not determined, it's not proven, but it seems to be the case enough. Now, more than that, if you go to the left-hand chart, that's the same information for kid survival by the sire of the dam. In other words, the dad of the mother of the dad of the daughters of all that one particular sire. One on the left, let's take an example, had a kid survival rate of 85%, regardless of what the mother was. Influence of the sire appears to have provided 85% survival. And at the other end, all the daughters of that sire lost 75% of their kids, had a survival rate of 25%. So that appears to be telling us in a very statistically thin way that the father of your females is very important to the survival rate of your kids. I'll leave that to Gordon to work out. So let's just wrap it up here. That's just a cheerful picture. So what have we learned under these years? And how might they help people who are thinking of getting into it? Well, the first thing is that genetic selection is just absolutely 100% essential to making progress with productivity. And that really has to be done with data and preferably with KidPlan. Our experience was that from 1999 to 2009, we lifted by visual selection and structural selection, we lifted the appearance of our flock to a point where we were quite pleased with it. But at the same time, our productivity had gone nowhere. It was well below where it should be, and it was not getting any better. So, of course, visual selection is critical. And of course, structural selection is even more important. But if you rely on those two things, you really are on a hiding to nothing as far as risking your production gains is concerned. And those production gains can be very, very significant. So let's go to fertility. It's very seldom a problem. These goats are just amazingly fertile animals, both the sires and the dams. You should be targeting 200% twinning. You should be targeting 160 to 180% weaning. You will not know what's happening with that, regardless whether you're commercial or seed stock, whatever it is. You will not know how well you're doing on that front unless you prig scan. And you have to prig scan for multis, not just wet and dry, not just singles and twins. You have to know how many fetuses you had and then how many you marked. And the difference is the profit you didn't get. That's a very sobering number, very often. So preg scanning, we would say, is absolutely essential. Now, if you start to think you've got a problem, the indications we've got are, think about your scrotal circumferences first, think about the size, and think about the size of the dams, because that could be where the problem is. Now, going to carcasses, that's body and carcass weight can be improved, as I've shown, with financial benefits that really are enormous. You can improve the muscularity, which doubles up on your carcass merit. If you think you've got a problem, it's very slow to change the females. First place to go is better carcass type size. Doesn't matter what breed they are, they need to be able to give you carcass weight and armor depth. Now on survival is what can really flog you. And you won't find that out. You won't find out how much you're losing, as I said before, until you preg scan for twins and trips. It's possible that particularly in the rangelands, the losses are small. But I really suspect the losses are potentially very, very big and the biggest factor. We're trying to work out what are the causes. There are many causes. If you think you've got a problem, it's worth keeping an eye, thinking about birth weights. That's the first culprit often. If you can't weigh birth weights, think about weaning weights. And then think about whether your kids are vigorous, whether your sires are sires that seem to give good survival, and whether the size of your females likewise. And lastly, but only applicable in some places, is the business of worm resistance. Everywhere we've looked, there is a massive dispersion of worm egg burdens within groups of animals running together. And anybody who's got worms knows that there is no misery like drenching a mob of wormy goats. So what we do, and what our suggestion is, we test individual animals, we cull on individual worm counts or EBVs, and it makes an enormous difference. If you have the opportunity, that is something you can, of course, do in your own sire group. It's quite simple. It's an unpleasant business, but it's pretty straightforward. You can do it in your own sire group, and it's well worth doing. Or you can go looking for EBVs and worm-resistant animals. So there you have it. The most important thing is data and genetic selection along with your other selection. Second biggest thing to think about is just your kid survival, finding out whether you're actually losing. Fertility, don't worry about. Worm resistance applies in some places, and your body and muscularity can be improved very substantially over time by selecting with some data. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening. Here's a happy snap to end with, and I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Colin. That was a really fantastic, comprehensive look into the production of meat goats, and extremely relevant, and I certainly learned a lot. Just to give you a bit of a breather, I'll just remind everyone, if you do have to leave not now, there will be a poll pop up when you go to leave the webinar. So please, if you could take the time to answer the questions within this poll or survey. It's the information that we take back to MLA to make sure that the information you are given tonight and the information that we're providing you through these webinars are what you are after, and that we're targeting the right questions. So if you could just take your time to work out that poll, that would be great. I'm getting a few questions in now. I just wanted to start with one from David, Colin. So in relation to the kid losses that you reported, did this correlate to your feral nannies and first crosses at startup to the boar composites now, or was it better or worse?
Unfortunately, we weren't recording at that stage. When we had ferals and first and second crosses, we hadn't yet got on to any of this. So we don't know, and it's obviously a really, really important question. It's too late for us to do it now, but all I'd suggest is anybody who's starting to cross up should be scanning, regardless of what cross it is, and comparing that with marking numbers. And that will tell you. There may be people out there who know the answer to this, but we don't.
Okay, thanks for the question, David. Just keep coming in with your questions. Write them in the question box that's provided, guys. I've got a question for you, Colin. So out of all the key learnings that you came across, which there were a number of in the presentation we've just heard, if I was a new producer, what would be the one thing that I could take away from this presentation and adopt it in my business?
The key thing above all is don't trust your visual assessment. The genetics that controls the productivity of the animal is hidden deep, deep inside the animal. You cannot see it. It doesn't matter how expert you are, how many thousand animals you've looked at in your life, you cannot see the genes. And the genes which will give you fantastic production characteristics may be living in your herd in a rabbity looking horrible animal that you would cull if you were only doing it on visuals. You have to pay attention, of course, to the structure. Everybody automatically looks at the appearance, but you have to use data somehow to identify the best genetics, and maybe even more important, getting the bad genetics out of your herd and making sure you don't use sires with bad genetics is possibly even more important than finding the good ones, because a bad one that you let loose on your herd, you won't discover it for 2 or 3 years, and he will cruel your production for years.
Thanks, Colin. So a question from Glenda. How do you measure birth weights in a large mob? Do you have any tips or tricks?
There isn't a trick, Glenda, that I know of. It's a lot of patience. We just hook them by the leg with a spring bounce. It takes a couple of seconds each. As long as you get it at the right time, it's not too onerous. Do it at the same time as you're tagging, if you do tagging. It's amazing how quickly the information builds up, but I don't know any shortcut.
If anyone does, please send them through. So that seems to be all for the questions, unless you want to get, there's just one come through from David. How many seed stock producers are using KidPlan now? And are any of them non-boar breeders?
As far as I know, they're all boar breeders. There's about half a dozen in Australia. There's one in New Zealand. There's one in the US, and there's a couple of new ones coming in Australia that I'm aware of. So the numbers are still quite small. The leader in this whole EBV thing is Isabel Palmer at the Tambuki study in Western Australia. She's got the highest terminal EBVs. Judorman Park does it. Terramac does it in Queensland. Cadenza does it in Victoria. Those are the ones that come to mind.
Excellent. We'll keep an eye out for them. So just a few thank yous coming through, Colin. Adam would like to say thank you from Adam in Adelong. And Sandra just wanted to say great talk, terrific graphs and data. Just another question that's come through from Tracy. How long has KidPlan been in operation and who developed the plan?
KidPlan's a spin-off of Breed Plan and all the statistics that goes behind that. I don't know when it started specifically, but I know it was used. KidPlan was used on the very first Terrawina animals, which were grown in South Australia at Terrawina, from the first embryos that came in. So that was the middle 80s. And then anybody who goes back to the KidPlan database will find well-recorded animals dating from about 1987 or something like that. It fell into disuse in the 90s, but sheep genetics kept it going, and then there was renewed use somewhere in the early 2000s.
So Tracy just followed up with that. I'm not sure if you could shed a bit more light, Colin. And do you know who developed KidPlan as it is today?
Yes, it was developed by Sheep Genetics in Armidale. And it's managed by them, and they manage the Lamb Plan databases, the Merino Select databases, the KidPlan databases, and no doubt lots of others as well. It's all at UNE. It's at the Sheep Genetics at UNE in Armidale.
Excellent.
And they're still developing it, and they do courses on it and all sorts of things.
Excellent. Well, that seems to be all for the questions at the moment. So, Colin, if anyone would like to get in touch with Colin, please send me an email and I can pass on his details. These webinars are being recorded, so they will be you will be able to access them on the MLA website on a platform to be announced at a later date. So if you know of anyone who missed out tonight and would like a recording of the webinar, please get in contact with me. I can send one sooner than that. Thanks again, Colin, for joining us. I really enjoyed your presentation, and thank you to everyone who tuned in tonight. And keep an eye out for our next webinar.
It's a pleasure. Thank you all for listening.